What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Today we're going over line, fishing rods, and what line to use with which bait and which rod. Stay tuned. So to start off, I want to say that this is covering mostly bait casting rods for bass fishing. You can apply these applications to other types of fishing as well, including spinning reels, but this is mainly towards bait casting and bass fishing. So let's go ahead and just kick it off here. We're gonna start with what type of line. So generally when you're bass fishing, you're gonna wanna use fluorocarbon line. So right here, we have 12-pound Guggen Squad fluorocarbon. Now you ask, why do you use fluorocarbon line? You know, that stuff is really expensive. Well, some of you may know, fluorocarbon is nearly invisible underwater and has little to no stretch, making it a very strong and resistant line. Now there are times when you would want to use things such as braid and monofilament line, but for the most part you're going to be using fluorocarbon while bass fishing. I want to keep this video roughly an intermediate level, so I may make some generalizations and such like that, but if there's anything you need to know, want to know, or have questions about, leave a comment down in the description and I'll be sure to answer that. You can also follow me on my social media profiles, also linked down below, as well as if you're wondering where to get any of this stuff from, check the description, it's always in there. Alright, so let's jump into this. Let's start with 12-pound fluorocarbon line. This is going to be honestly one of my most used lines. I only use 12-pound fluorocarbon. This just happens to be Guggen Squad by Ketchco. I use 12-pound. I use 17-pound. I should have did this in order. My bad. 17-pound. 15-pound very rarely. And then I also use 65-pound braid. We'll get into the braid in a little bit, but like I said, starting with 12-pound fluorocarbon. What would you use this for? Well, for me personally, I use 12-pound line, fluorocarbon line specifically, for things such as crankbaits. The reason you use this line specifically for crankbaits is, I mean, it's honestly pretty simple once you know the facts of the line and how line affects your baits. So fluorocarbon doesn't float, which is really good when you're using crankbaits most of the time. Since fluorocarbon doesn't float, it'll enable your bait to hit the maximum depth it can dive a lot easier. So by using fluorocarbon, you get your maximum depth, you get enough power to hook a large fish, and it's a very tough line, so you don't have to worry nearly as much about this line rubbing against tree limbs or rocks or any kind of structure. It'll be a long time before this line ever frays or breaks. Okay, so here we have one of my crankbait setups. This has 12-pound fluorocarbon line on it, paired up with a Shimano Corrado DC in 7.4 gear ratio with a crankbait. This right here is the Guggen Squad Banger in Sriracha Craw color. Really nice bait. I love the hooks. These are KVD triple grips that come stock. Great for the price. Anyways, back to the line. You would use 12-pound fluorocarbon with your crankbait setup, ideally. Not everyone has a ton of setups, but 12-pound is what you would ideally want to use for crankbaits. Now, I should also note that doesn't include oversized crankbaits. We'll get to that in a little bit. But for your average size square bills, such as this, 12-pound is just fine. You could even go 10, but 12 is where you want to be at personally. So the rod that I have this paired up with is a Guggen Squad Gold Series reaction rod. Now this specifically is a medium power, moderate action rod, which is absolutely perfect for crankbaits. The reason being, I'll show you a little bit more of the rod here. So the reason this medium moderate rod is just excellent for crankbaits. Now, I do want to say this isn't a glass rod. I do have another glass rod that I'll show you in a minute. So the reason you want a medium power rod for crankbait fishing, power means how much weight the rod can handle, essentially. And your action explains how fast and how far before the rod bends. So with a crankbait specifically, you're not usually, hook setting the fish that often. Generally, you just reel in your crankbait and then you feel the fish and you pull into it, right? And since you have that moderate action, when the fish comes up and it jumps, this tip, since it's loaded further down onto the rod, this tip isn't going to release right away. It's going to stay loaded, giving the time for the fish to jump out of the water and then come back in without shaking those treble hooks out of its mouth. If you had a fast action rod, there are many times when the fish jumps, that tip, it'll be loaded, and then when it jumps, it'll release real quick, giving slack on the line, and then your lure just goes flying out of the fish's mouth. So ideally, you want a moderate action rod with a medium to medium heavy power. I suppose I'll throw a little bit of information about the reel as well. So this is a 7.4 gear ratio reel on this. Ideally, you want a 6 to 7 gear ratio reel for crankbaits, because when you get into higher reel speeds, you can always slow down. It's very hard to slow down, I've found personally. But when you get into those higher speeds, your bait doesn't sink as low in the water column because you're reeling it so fast, it doesn't give it the correct action that it should have in the water. So you want to have a slower reel on any crankbait rod if possible. Now, little disclaimer, any 7.2, 7.3, 4, 5 reel can throw just about anything you would want to pair up with it. You don't have a million setups, just get a 7 gear ratio reel, 7.2 to 7.5, let's say, and that could be your standard reel for anything you want to throw. Let's move on to your little bit upsized or oversized, swim baits or crankbaits. Let's take this off here. So as I was just saying, oh, looks like my tape fell off. As I was just saying though about the reel speed, this one happens to be a 6.2 gear ratio Shimano Corrado DC. So this rod specifically is a glass rod, a fiberglass rod, and I think it's a glass graphite mix actually. But the action on this is also a moderate, but this is more for, like I said, my oversized or slightly larger swim baits or crankbaits, anything like that. So this rod here is 7 foot 4 inches, and it is a medium heavy power with a moderate action. It is just absolutely excellent. Like, honestly, this is my favorite rod to throw a crankbait on so far. Although, disclaimer, I haven't had a chance to try the Guggen graphite ones. But glass, to me, is just amazing with crankbaits. A little bit larger, being 7.4, and it has the slower reel. I tend to throw the larger size crankbaits, like I keep saying. And although I have 12-pound, I believe it's 12-pound on here now. Let's see. Yep, I have 12-pound fluorocarbon on this as well. If I knew that I was going to go out and only throw big lures on this, I'd be using 15-pound fluorocarbon for sure. And that is just because you want to make sure your line can actually, withstand the weight of the bait you're throwing. And if I'm throwing a swim bait and it's 6 or 8 inches long, whatever, you're going to want to upsize your line a little bit just to ensure that you can hook up on a fish. You're not going to break your line just casting, because those swim baits and stuff get really expensive. So let's just do a quick overview of the crankbait portion of this video. You want a slower gear ratio reel between 6 and 7 gear ratio. That could be 6.2, 4, 5, or 7.2, 4, 5, just nothing higher than that. You want 12 to 15 pound fluorocarbon, depending on the size of bait you're going to be throwing. And it also kind of depends on location, but generally 12 will get you done, 15 will get you done. And you want a medium to medium heavy power rod with a moderate action, whether that be graphite or fiberglass rod. Okay, so moving up the scale, we went from 12 to 15 pound fluorocarbon to now 17 pound fluorocarbon line. Now, what do we use 17 pound fluorocarbon line on? I mean, the fish aren't even that big, right? Well, one of the reasons you use the larger line is for A, your lure size, and B, the type of structure you're fishing around. So if I'm fishing, really thick mats or anything where I'm gonna need to hook set, just drive the hook set into a fish, such as baits like a jig or a chatterbait. Here we have the, let's see, let me unhook this here. Here we have a Guggen Squad clickbait. Brand new on the market, very nice. So I use 17 pound on this because I want to have enough power to, number one, hook set through thick cover. Like I was saying, it could be timber, because your line's rubbing against timber and stuff. It could be weeds, mats, lily pads, anything like that. You're gonna want to upsize your line for things like the jig or chatterbait bladed jig. This setup specifically, we have the 17 pound Guggen Squad fluorocarbon. We have a Shimano SLX DC in 7.2 gear ratio reel. And then paired up, we have the Guggen Squad Gold Series reaction rod once again. Since this rod is the reaction rod in the Gold Series, this is a 7'2" medium moderate rod. And then keeping in line with the gear ratios, when you're using things such as the jig or chatterbait or clickbait, you're gonna want something a little bit faster. Not extra fast, but that medium, that 7.0 range. So this one specifically 7.2. You could go up to 7.4, 7.5. It won't affect it. The reason you want to have that extra speed though versus a slower reel is when you're fishing a jig, when you're fishing a chatterbait, you're gonna be flipping that bait in there, skipping it in there, whatever, real quick. And if you don't get a bite within the first few seconds, say on a jig, you're just reeling in real quick to cast out to another spot. And with a chatterbait, you just want to be able to have a nice steady reel, and when that fish hits it, you want to be able to catch up your line real quick. So having that faster gear ratio reel really helps that. Continuing where we left off, we have still 17 pound fluorocarbon line. This time, this is both my weightless soft plastic rod, for right now anyways, and my weighted soft plastic rod. This is a 7'3" medium heavy fast action rod paired up with the Shimano Corrado DC and 8.5 gear ratio reel with, again, 17 pound fluorocarbon. Now I use 17 pound fluorocarbon for my soft plastics because when you're fishing that, you're fishing usually near cover. Again, you're fishing your timber, you're fishing your rocks, you're fishing just any kind of structure, right? That could even just mean lily pads or just flipping into weeds, anything like that. So you want to have that extra power with the 17 pound line to ensure when you hook set and you're pulling that fish through all that cover to get it back to shore or your boat, that it's not going to break, it's not going to fray, nothing like that. So 17 pound is excellent for that, as well as this is the extra fast gear ratio reel that I've been talking about. Now this is 8.5 gear ratio. That means when you crank this reel, one turn of this reel is, I believe, 36 inches of line that come in. I could be wrong, don't quote me. But I believe it's 36. That is pretty crazy if you think about it. Just one turn, 36 inches of line comes in. Now why is that good? Well, when you're fishing things like your soft plastics, again, you're flipping it in there, pitching it in there, whatever, and or you know, making short casts to little pockets or areas, blah blah blah. And again, if you don't get that bite in the first, say, 30 seconds of your cast, you're probably going to want to reel in really quick, and it saves on your wrist. And having that extra fast gear ratio, when those fish come up and just clobber your bait, you're going to be able to reel just like you normally would, you know, maybe speed up just a little bit. But naturally, since this is the higher ratio, you're going to be able to catch up on slack line way quicker than you would on a slow gear ratio reel. So if you can have multiple setups, get a high gear ratio reel paired with a medium heavy 7-foot 7.2 rod, and that'll just be excellent for your soft plastics no matter what you're throwing. All right, and lastly, we have our braided fishing line. I use specifically 65-pound Guggen Squad braid in partner with Ketchco, and I pair that on a 7-foot medium heavy fast action rod with a 7.5 gear ratio reel. This is just a Lew's Mach 2 combo. I've had this thing for years, and if you can only pick up one rod and reel, like just say you're not that into fishing as much as I am, you know, you just go once in a while, you go just on the weekends or something. Lew's Mach 2 combo, absolutely excellent. Comes in, I think it's like 150 bucks maybe. Yeah, it's great. But anyways, 65-pound braid. Why in the heck do I use 65-pound braid? Well, when I'm fishing braid, I'm fishing topwater baits, such as a topwater frog, a popping frog. So again, I use that braid just for the power of it. Well, the power and the fact that it floats. So when you're fishing the topwater frog, you want that frog to stay on top of the water as much as possible. If I were fishing fluorocarbon, it might tend to dip the nose in the water slightly, which you don't want that when you're fishing topwater. And even though this is braid, I can tie a leader on it, so I can run all braid and then have like a 2-foot leader of monofilament, and that allows me to use baits such as the poppers. You know, I can use whopper ploppers, walking baits, anything like that, and it won't get caught up in the braid. So braid is just an excellent choice for any of those style baits. And ideally, if I had only a topwater setup though, this is just kind of like one of my spare rods that I made into topwater. I would have an extra fast gear ratio reel, so that would be like an 8.5, and then I would have an extra heavy rod with a fast action. That would be my ideal topwater setup. But for now, this is what I have, and this is why I use braid. Okay, so I think I covered all of the basics and got a little bit into the intermediate side of this, but I want to round this out for any of the new people that are watching this video. If you can only get one bait casting rod, you want a 7-foot to 7'2" length, medium heavy power, fast action rod with a 7.2, 7.4, or 7.5 gear ratio reel with, I'm going to tell you to go with 15-pound fluorocarbon on that bait casting rod. 15-pound is you know, it's the in-between. You can still use a jig on it, you can use your crankbaits on it. It won't be as technique specific, but that'll get you to where your one setup can do absolutely everything you want it to do. It won't be the best on top water, but you'll have one good setup that can do everything without spending thousands of dollars. And now, I know some of you are using spinning rods still. This is more towards, like I said, the bass fishermen, for bait casters. But if you're using a spinning rod for bass fishing, you can still apply these techniques in line to your spinning rod. It just won't be as ideal. Most of the time, you're going to want to use monofilament, especially if you're very new at this. You're going to want to be using monofilament spinning rod. I get it. It's a lot cheaper and easier to use. For something like that, I would probably always use a 14 to 16 pound monofilament line. But again, you can apply all of these line application techniques, whatever you want to call it, to your type of fishing. It doesn't matter, you know, where you live. You can live up north in the States, down south. Down south, you always want to upsize a little bit, generally. Like, for example, in Florida, when you're pitching, you know, your jigs, they're using 20, 25 pound fluorocarbon, and up here that's unheard of. But I hope the video did help. Again, if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. Follow me on my socials. You can find all of these products linked down below. And with that being said, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, tell your friends, get somebody new to fishing, and I will see you later.